All right, folks. Sounds like the mic is live. I guess that means it's time to get started, right? So welcome today to Build Confidence as a Negotiator. And I'm glad to see so many folks here. I see a couple of friendly faces out in the crowd. We'll go ahead and get started. We have to post the forward-looking statements, so read through that really fast, okay? All right, so I said read it fast. Well, I'm delighted to be back for my fourth time at Cvent CONNECT. And today we're going to talk about some strategies that will help you build your confidence as a negotiator. So are you ready to get started? Yes. All right, let's do this. We're going to start with the poll. I like to kind of see how people are feeling in the room about how you feel about negotiating. So your choices are terrified, confused, confident. There is a chance that maybe you're feeling all of the above at one given time in any different negotiation that you might be doing. And after today, you're going to have the resources that you need, hopefully, to become more confident in your negotiations. And unfortunately, I can't see the poll results. And so as y'all are taking it, Kelly in the back of the room is going to help me see what folks are feeling here.
Teresa, it looks like overwhelmingly the responses are leaning towards confused. We have 55% of the room at confused, 22 at terrified, 22 at confident.
Good, we've got some confident folks in here. Do you want to come up with me? I'm just teasing. Okay, so what if I told you that we're all born negotiators? Anybody believe that? He just followed me home. I promise to feed him and take care of him if I can keep him. If I can keep him, I promise to get straight A's on my next report card. My favorite? If we don't keep him, he'll probably die. Or maybe if you've been around kids, just one more book, just one more cookie. I mean, we started out our lives negotiating. And this scenario that I just put out to you is a classic example of what I call expanding the pie. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth as we go through. But if the parent says yes, then they get a motivated child who is going to accept responsibility and improve their academics. Pretty good, right? If the kid gets to keep the puppy, kid's going to be pretty happy. And the real winner in this whole thing is the puppy, exactly. So keep that in mind as we go through today and then as you're going about thinking about your next negotiation. So show of hands, how many of you, when you think about a negotiation, you think of a competition? Nobody's raising their hands, but I see a lot of heads. Okay, now I see lots of heads shaking, lots of heads going up and down. So negotiation, there's 5 different styles, and there's an article that I pulled this from as a resource, and toward the end of the day today, you'll have access to a resource page on my website, and you can go back and read this article. But there is one style of negotiation that is competition, and that's the first style, and that's really I win, you lose. And that kind of style could be useful on a one-off. You know, you're buying a car, you're buying a house, or even in our industry, if you're making a one-time purchase and price and availability is really the only thing you need to worry about. But then there's the accommodate. And some of us in the industry feel like relationships are paramount and that the best way to win people over is to give them what they want. It's important to remember if this happens to be your default style, that what's important to you might not be important to the person that you're negotiating with. And notice I said negotiating with, not against. In almost all of the negotiations that you're going to encounter, maybe except for the compete style, you're going to be negotiating with somebody because it really does take 2 people to put together a deal. Then the third style, I kind of hesitate to even call it a style because if you avoid the negotiation, there's no negotiation. You know, that's where both parties aren't willing to express their needs and ask for what they need and want. Compromise is interesting because I think most people, when they hear negotiation, if they're not thinking competition, they're thinking there's going to be a compromise. And that's not necessarily wrong, but when you meet halfway in the middle, then both sides have given up something. And if you can move into the collaboration style of negotiations, that's when both sides win, or three sides if you're talking about a puppy, and you expand the pie. All right, any questions on that? Okay. And I think questions go into the app, and then Kelly will read them as we go along, and certainly we'll have plenty of time at the end for a Q&A. All right, so we've talked about the 5 different negotiation styles. Here are 3 common scenarios that you'll encounter. And the first one, obviously, is the one-time negotiation. You're probably never going to speak to these people again. And the example, again, would be a car purchase, a home purchase, or maybe a one-time materials purchase for an event that you might be planning for. And this is the place where you might see the compete style come up, because it's really just a transaction. You're not trying to build a relationship. Repeated negotiations are those where, there's a good chance there's going to be another interaction with your negotiation partner. Preferred suppliers, where you're going to be using them on and on again, and each time you're going to need to negotiate a new scope of work. But the last kind is a strategic negotiation. And that's going to be more like a joint venture. And a great example that I can think of in our industry is, we've got Cvent, they're the tech provider, and then they may partner with solution delivery consultants that would help them deliver their solutions. That kind of negotiation is going to be much longer term. There's going to be a lot more time spent on it, and the strategy and the relationship outcome is going to be the real focus on that. Another example could be multi-year agreements with a destination. So this is our second time in San Antonio. There's a negotiation that has to happen with the convention center, but in order for that to work, there have to be enough hotels that are willing to come into the picture, and then ground transportation and all of those other things. So that's another example of a strategic negotiation. How many of you prepare before you negotiate? Good. See, quite a few people raising their hands. That's excellent. Whenever I'm getting ready to negotiate, the first thing I ask is, what problem do I need to solve? And what do I need to solve it? And that could be maybe negotiating with a hotel. So I need sleeping rooms, meeting space that will accommodate the group size and the budget. I have a set budget. I need to bring in my own production company. And I have set dates. My dates are not flexible. Those are my needs. My wants are a sunny location and a 4-star property. Everybody wants that, or 5-star. And then the deal breaker might be sharing space with a competitor. Okay, but you can think of a lot of other scenarios where you want to make your list, think about what you're willing to give up, absolutely know what your deal breakers are. And then here's something to think about. Ask your negotiating partner what they need and want. And when you ask, then that will often speed along the negotiations, because both parties know right up front what's most important to them. Okay? How many of you think you have failed if you don't make the deal? A couple people. I'm here to tell you that no deal is better than a bad deal. So if you don't know what BATNA means, it is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And this is what's going to be your fallback position if the negotiation isn't successful, doesn't move in the direction you need it to be. So here's where you're going to really want to think about what your alternatives are. Again, make your list. Their preparation is all about making lists, right? And then evaluate what your options are. So some examples could be, other suppliers. Maybe you've run an RFP for maybe production services, and the responses that you got weren't exactly what you wanted. You might just choose to look at a different supplier. Unless you have fixed dates, then you could look at alternate destinations or alternate dates, or you could just take a totally different approach. So, if you can't secure what you need within your budget, then either maybe ask for some more budget, we all want that, or try to think of some ways that you could configure what you're trying to get to differently in order to match up with what your needs are. Any questions on that so far? How are we doing, Kelly, on the?
Mic is now on.
Mic
I do
is
have
on.
one question for you that came through, and reminder to everyone, please get your questions in. When time is limited and things need to happen quickly, how do you collaborate with that in mind?
Ooh, that is a good one. In the negotiation sessions that I've attended, the compressed time frame is most often when people go to a compete position. That's not to say that you can't still collaborate. And I think when time is limited, that's most important for you to ask the question, what's most important? Because studies show that when both parties know what the end goal is, they can get there more quickly. So even if you end up in a compete situation, asking the other side what's most important isn't necessarily a bad thing. We good?
How do you manage a middle person role where a stakeholder is demanding concessions you don't necessarily agree with but are directed to request?
I'm going to repeat that. So if a stakeholder is asking for concessions, is that what you said?
Yes.
Concessions that you're not sure are going to fly. Many of us are in that position, right? And I think the question then is maybe asking your stakeholder what is important to them about that particular concession. And that might be something that you glean out of, maybe what you thought was important to them isn't as important as what they're bringing up. So ask the question, and then, of course, as a trusted advisor, you always have to be in a position to either say, I'll ask, or, I could ask, but that might put us at a disadvantage for some of the further conversations down the line. Okay?
The questions are rolling in if you want to take more right now.
Let's go ahead and move on, and then we'll save them for the end, and I will take a couple more as we go through, okay? All right. Another thing to stop and think about is what's worked in the past. And, thinking about what did work is helpful. How have you approached this previously? How did it make you feel? One of the things I learned in the last session that I took on negotiations is feelings are facts. And if something that you did, the last negotiation you went through, you came away feeling good, chances are the approach you took was a good one. If you came away feeling badly, then something didn't work out right. So go back and think of the ones where you felt good at the end of them and the ones that you didn't feel so good about, and really hone in on maybe the ones that you didn't feel so good about, to see where it went wrong, and that will position you to be in a better spot going forward. So, what would you do the same? What would you change? And again, feelings are facts. Let your gut be, your guide as you work along through some of these conversations. Who are you negotiating with? You want to consider the perspective of the person who's sitting across the table from you. And again, who you're negotiating with, not who you're negotiating against, because the more collaboration you can put into it, the more success you'll have. How are they compensated? If you're the meeting planner or the event organizer, how's the hotelier compensated? How long have they been with the company? What are their goals and aspirations? What could be their walkaway alternatives? And if you're on the supplier side, talking with an event organizer, think about the things they're concerned about. How are they compensated? What are their success factors? And the more you know about who you're working with, the more chance you have of being successful in your outcome as you go forward. There we go. I think the most important part about this is trust. Trust matters. And if you look in the dictionary, the first definition or typical definitions are to deal with, to arrange or bring about through conference, compromise, and discussion, or to arrive at the settlement of some matter. Yep, that's probably about right. But another way to think about it is to successfully travel along or over. If you look in Merriam-Webster, I think that's number 4 in the definition. And if you look at the graphic on the slide, who would you rather work with? If you're going up this hillside, or imagine, going on down a raging river, do you want somebody along your side that you trust, or somebody that you don't really trust? I think I'm going to pick the person I trust. So the way you build trust and get to the point where you can expand the pie is by asking questions. But not just any question. The right kind of questions matter. In case you didn't notice from the first slide, I've raised 2 children. They are now adult sons. But in addition to can I have, there was an awful lot of, why can't I? How come? And even in business, I've encountered folks that, I was trying to bring them along and train them the ropes, and they were like, why are you doing it that way? If somebody asks you that question, how do you feel? Like, what do you mean, why am I doing that way? It's kind of off-putting, and, in the case of kids, it's just downright annoying. So, so imagine, why can't we have a 2-week cutoff date? Well, I'm sure the DOS is going through their heads about 17 reasons why. But what if you asked, what are your concerns about a 2-week cutoff? And then they could say, well, we're not really sure we're going to be able to fill the rooms, and we don't want you to be in a nutrition situation, fill in the blank, whatever other answer they could give you. And then you can have a conversation. In fact, I had this with one of my clients just right before I got on the plane to come down here. And that is, if you're not sure you're going to have names to put on your rooming list, but you still want to keep the rooms, you can always guarantee them. Or there could be some other way to go about it. But why can't we doesn't get you very far. What are your concerns, or tell me more, are the sorts of things that can help you along. Another one is, why is your proposal so expensive? If you've ever heard me talk before, I also say, when you're running an RFP, give the budget so that they know kind of what they're supposed to be working in. Nevertheless, a better question could be, what changes could we make to have this be more affordable? So I think that gives you a sense of, how you can go about asking your questions. And again, how could this happen? What could be some things that we could think about? Which do you prefer? All of those are going to give you quite a bit more information about what the circumstances are on the other side of the table. And information is really important to get you where you need to be. Okay, so I'm going to pause here and see about questions that are from you here in the audience, and we'll see what's next.
I'm going to go with the most upvoted question. What's the most effective way to negotiate cost to bring it down?
Oh, that's a whole nother session. No, so, and that's actually a great question. I'm just being silly. The most effective way to negotiate cost to bring it down is to ask questions. What are the cost drivers? So, I'll give you an example, from the Wayback Machine. It was a little different, but, when I worked at Microsoft, we had a very elaborate production set, and so we always needed a lot of load-in time. And they were going to, charge us extra load-in days. And here's another example of, expanding the pie. We're like, well, what if we worked with your event that's happening before us, shared some of their load-in time, we can hang our trusses and set the lights, and in return, they can use those lights for their production and enhance their production. We ended up saving the extra cost, the extra rental cost for the load-in. So that's a little different, but if you're looking at, I see somebody shaking the back, like, yep. If it's food and beverage, then you can look at, what kinds of things are you looking at ordering? Could you reconfigure how you're establishing what your agenda looks like? When it comes to AV, again, understanding what the cost drivers are, maybe you could look at a different kind of configuration. Sometimes one of the things that I always liked to do was, how can we work together on this? And sometimes they might say, well, hey, if we can get your next 2 events, then we can bulk order some of this stuff and it'll save us money. And then we can pass some of the savings on to you. So the more questions you ask, the more information you're gonna get. And in some cases, the event organizer might be asking for something that's really, it seems perfectly reasonable to you, but what the supplier is gonna have to do to make it happen is gonna be a lot. And so, what could we do differently, I think is probably the most important question on that one.
This one is a good follow-up. How should I negotiate for a client when they may not deserve that concession or they want something completely unreasonable? Help.
I'm not sure if that's a negotiation question. Again, I've kind of been there, especially if you're a third party, right? You've got to straddle the line between working with your hotel partners or your suppliers, whoever else they may be, and then you've got your client who's paying you to work on their behalf. And, it doesn't ever hurt you to ask the question. And if you know it's a ridiculous ask, you can say, I'm going to ask you a question that I've been asked by my client, and here it is. And they can go, no. Or, huh. And I will say, before you say they don't deserve, and I would love to whoever that was to come talk to me afterwards because I'd love to hear the backstory on that. But, there might be something under there, and again, that might be something that's most important to them, and they might be willing to give up other things in order to get that one concession. So some of the things I teach sometimes is, depending on what your, who your event audience is, I think a lot of times people go, and I'm not gonna dive down too much into hotel, I promise, but people tend to go, the first thing they ask about is, what's your room rate? Well, if the attendees are paying the room rate, and you're still gonna get them a better deal than what they would get paying on their own, maybe looking at the room rate isn't the thing you should be asking about. Maybe it should be that concession that you don't feel like your client deserves, but is important to them. So really, I encourage you all to just ask curious questions, because sometimes you just, and you think they're gonna say no, but you ask, and they're like, well, either maybe, or can't do that, but what about this? And then you just got an alternative that you didn't think of, your client didn't think of, that they might even like better. Do we have another one?
Yes. Being someone who is new to negotiating contracts, what is your best advice you can give someone like me who is going up against some seasoned negotiators?
Breathe and prepare. So all these things that we've just been talking about, you may be new to the industry, but you can still educate yourself on what cost drivers there are, if you're working with a hotel, understanding what, if you can understand the basic revenue streams for a hotel and what their profit margins are, then you're in a better position to know that, food and beverage profit is usually about 35%, and sleeping room profits are anywhere from 80 to 85, sometimes higher, depending on, the star rating of the hotel. When you have that knowledge, then you're in a better position to understand what you might or might not be successful at getting in your negotiations. And don't be afraid. Just because you're new, it doesn't mean, if you do these things that we're talking about today, it doesn't mean you're not going to be successful working with someone who is more seasoned in the industry.
So this one has to do with internal negotiation with stakeholders. I need help understanding how to internally negotiate with leadership and stakeholders and balancing different strong desires for the event that does not have clear KPIs. What does it look like? Lunch chats, formal meetings, emails? Live with it?
Don't live with it. Way back in my career, I took a leadership program, and the first principle they taught us was resolve conflict promptly. And if you live with it, that conflict is just gonna grow and grow. And you're gonna get a lot of misalignment between the teams, and negative intent starts coming out. So no matter what you're negotiating, even if it's the one more cookie or the puppy, resolve your conflicts as promptly and quickly as you can. go back to that question, what's most important to you? And you can say, I hear from you that you want to 2x our attendees. That might be from the marketing people. I hear from you, the CFO, that you want to keep our budget flat. And I hear from, a third stakeholder that they want the 4-star property in a sunny location. I just made that up. So asking each one of them which is most important, how can we work together to have a successful event with the budget constraints we have, 2xing the attendee list. Well, those two might be mutually exclusive, so then now you've got to get this person and this person talking together, and you can facilitate that conversation, which is indeed a negotiation. Do I have another one?
Yes, many more.
Okay.
How do you stop the negotiation process if you have a client that keeps asking after you thought you came to a final agreement?
Thank you for asking. What we've discussed is the best offer I can make for you at this time. It's totally fine to say, now, that sounds rather abrupt. What you could say is, to date, we have agreed on this and this. In order to move forward with the event, we need to finalize this agreement and get moving with the planning part. That's probably a more tactful way of putting it. But either party, when you've come to where your best and final is, then you need to state that at that point. All right, let's do one more, and then I'm going to finish up with the last couple slides I have, and then we'll spend the rest of the time with questions.
When is the right time to walk away from a deal, and how do you recognize that moment?
Let's go back a couple slides. I'm not going to click backwards, but your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, you have to have that in your head. No deal is better than a bad deal. And if you're feeling badly about it, a comment I forgot to make a little earlier on the compete particularly, whenever somebody says, take it or leave it, well, unless you gotta have it, leave it. And go look at your BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, and start working on that. Sometimes when you walk away, then they kind of go, wait, I was only kidding. I had that happen. When I was purchasing a home at one point, they were being kind of, difficult, and I was in a relocation situation, so I needed to get moving. And we said, all right, well, we're just going to look at another house. And then, suddenly the conversation changed. So, all right, I'm going to talk about an overlooked negotiation, and that's conflict resolution. Okay, you've negotiated your best deal, and despite your best efforts, something went wrong. That never happens, right? Raise your hand if you have managed an event where everything went perfectly. I was hoping to meet, here's a unicorn down front. All right, so here's a couple things that can cause it to go wrong. Miscommunication is almost always the root cause of anything that doesn't happen the way it's supposed to. There could be poor preparation on either or both sides, or there can be external forces, and external forces could be anything like tariffs. That was a joke on the main stage earlier today, so I feel like I picked a good one on that one. Traffic jams, your speaker might be late. What'd you say? Hurricane, exactly. Well, that's force majeure. Equipment breakdown, believe it or not, I always print out my slides because sometimes these things break, and despite everybody's best efforts, we can't get it back up again. So those are examples of things that can go wrong, okay? Unless it's illegal or impossible, which is force majeure, so a hurricane would indeed be a force majeure situation, you've got to come up with a solution. Have any of you encountered something like that? So this is not just like a little thing, this is something that the attendees noticed. So, that was problematic. All right, well, here's where you're gonna wanna go back to the collaboration elements that we were talking about. And I used to tell my manager a long time ago, the good news is events are a relationship business. The bad news is events are a relationship business. I also had to tell him, because he was a pretty, reserved guy, I was like, in events, we shake hands once and then hug forevermore. Am I right? So I was like, Warren, if you do not want to be hugged, you need to put your hand out to be shaken. Anyway, the point is that this is a relationship business. And so you really almost always want to preserve the relationship to get through the conflict. And, you want to avoid negative outcomes. The worst negative outcome would be legal action, a damaged or destroyed relationship, or reputation. And here is where you guys are going to get tired of hearing me say this, but what's important to you right now might be the most valuable question you can ask. You got to go with careful listening, because when, something's gone wrong, everybody's amped up and, they just want to make their point. So make sure you're being careful with your listening. Use neutral instead of negative language, and then, really identifying the underlying positions and interests is going to help you arrive at usually a mutually acceptable solution. And I will say that depending on the situation, you might need to bring a third party in to help you with this. And I wanted to talk about this because when I was at Microsoft, some of the most impactful negotiations I did were this. We had a hands-on lab that wasn't functional for most of an event. Well, there were a bunch of contributing factors, and I was the third party between the stakeholder and the supplier helping them get through. So those are some tools that you have in your toolbox in case something like this comes up on your event. And so with that, earlier I mentioned that you'll have access to a resource page on my website. We never, ever get through all of the questions. And so one of the things that you'll be able to do is book a call with me. And, a question that you didn't get answered, we can take some time one-on-one and go through it. And then, of course, you'll be invited to my Ask Me Anything call that I have each month. So while you guys are doing that, Kelly can field a couple more questions for me.
Here we go. My boss always tells me to ask for things that feel unreasonable by saying something like, we'll sign today if you cut proposal by 15K, for example. Is this outrageous or encouraged? Sorry to say, it usually works.
I think you have to know your audience. And I'm not a fan of that necessarily. Although I will say that when you sign a contract can impact your ability to get concessions. And, salespeople are compensated on their sales streams. So if it's at the end of the month, at the end of the quarter, end of the year, they may be willing and able to make some concessions. I prefer to be a little more transparent about things like that because for me, it's more of a relationship conversation. But if it works, and it's not somebody that you're going to need to negotiate with again and again, then that could be a tactic that can be effective.
What are some red flags to look for when negotiating with someone?
Closed body language. If they're not listening, if they're not willing to communicate or answer your questions, if they're not willing to answer what's most important to you, then you're probably in a compete environment, and then you just need to focus on getting the deal done at the best price you can do it.
When negotiating and the client says they have a better offer, is it okay to ask to view the offer?
Sure. You could at least ask for, what's better about it. Would you give me an opportunity to meet it? If the client is doing that often and you never see if there really is a credible offer, then that would be a fast one that somebody would be pulling. And going back to, the house purchase thing, if you do an above offer purchase, the real estate agent has to provide you with the competing offer that they turned down to take yours. So, there are environments where that's a legitimate question is, okay, you said that you got a better deal, show me.
Struggling with balancing keeping a friendly yet professional partnership with the hotel without being a pushover or people pleaser. Any advice?
Go back and read the article that I had on one of the earlier slides. So that's on the website. It's a very in-depth article about each of the different negotiation types, and that person sounds like they're kind of an appeaser. And so there are, each one of the negotiation styles, they talk about what the advantages and the disadvantages and how you can approach somebody who's got that style or what to do if you have that style. So that's a really good way to kind of become self-aware of what your fallback style might be, and then ways that you can get to, the moving more toward the collaborative style.
Could you give an example of what neutral versus negative language could look like in a situation?
Ooh, so it could be, well, I knew you'd look at it that way. That's kind of negative. Or tell me your concerns. That's more neutral. And again, more drawing out of what's really on the other person's mind. There's a lot of, there's probably a whole line of study that you could go down on that, but that would be one example that I can give you.
I like this one. Best recommendations to negotiate a higher salary.
Okay, and this is true story. So each year I go to several different industry conferences, and I always take the sessions on negotiations. And Alexandra Carter, whose name was quoted on one of my previous slides, she gave a session at PCMA Convening Leaders last year, and part of what she covered was, she actually had a role play session where people could role play asking for a higher salary. So she's also on that resource page. I really like her. She's got a great style to her. She learned mediation before she started doing her legal training. So she's really got a really human approach to negotiating. And, a lot of the approaches that I take, I learned directly from her.
Have you seen more success in reducing costs by negotiating the big ticket items for the event like room rental or F&B, or the smaller additions like signage?
I think that depends. And, because little, crumbs make loaves. As I was saying a little earlier, a lot of times people go straight for the room rate, and almost always right now, meeting room rental is waived if you've got a room block and you meet your food and beverage minimum. So that should almost be a given. But negotiating how high the food and beverage minimum might be, or some of, like the signage, some hotels are really accommodating on signage, and there are places in Las Vegas that will charge you a lot of money if you simply stick a Post-it note to the wall. It's a little of an exaggeration, but not much. So, I think it depends on sometimes signage can be a small portion of your budget, and other times it can be larger. As a rule, I always look at the biggest opportunity first. So the biggest cost element, maybe it is your convention center license agreement rental. Maybe you can save some on that, but not much. Then I might not spend as much time trying to get the cost on that down, and then go and look at some of the other things where I know I have more room to maneuver in terms of cost savings that could go in there. That was a good question.
Do you suggest the questions are asked over the phone with negotiating? Tone matters and can be taken out of context, but calls take time.
Oh boy. How many of you have had a cross text? Yeah. So and even emails can cross. You can do a certain amount of it, the prep work you can do through email or through, the RFP process through Cvent, or even your own RFP that you're issuing to, say, a production company. But when it really comes down to, getting to the back and forth, it is more expedient to get on the phone or on a Zoom or a Teams call and have the conversation. You can't always get on a plane and fly there, but having a live conversation is going to avoid the oops, maybe they said yes after you already assumed they would say no, and you don't want to negotiate against yourself, right? That is the one time you are negotiating against someone, is when you put out an offer, you don't let the other side respond, and then you put forth a different offer. So don't do that, or avoid doing that, I should say.
What can I do to preserve a professional relationship when my negotiating partner isn't treating me respectfully as a customer? but they represent a vendor that is often used throughout my company, and we cannot lose that relationship.
That's a tough one. So it sounds like somebody's got an account manager who is not being a very good account manager. And, there should always be, especially in a relationship where it's in the enterprise, this person doesn't have a choice to go to work with someone else, because it sounds like it's at least a preferred supplier relationship, if not one of those strategic partnerships that we talked about earlier. And what I would suggest to that person is, you can try to talk to the person. If they're kind of blowing you off, then ask to speak with their manager. And have a very candid conversation and bring forward some examples and just say, hey, this relationship is important to us, and either we need to get past this with your help, or I'm going to need to have a new account manager. And if the relationship is as big as it sounds, that company is probably going to take some kind of action on that. People aren't always nice. I hate to say it, but it's true.
I think this is the last one, Therese.
Okay.
When starting a negotiation, is it better to word it as ABC isn't going to work? Would you be willing to do XYZ? Or is it better to word it as we are worried about ABC? Is there anything you can do to work with us?
So in that example, a proposal has already been provided. So the negotiation has already begun because you've asked for something that you need, and the other party has given you a proposal to hopefully address what you asked. So that already started the negotiation process. I think it was, we're concerned about ABC, what can you do? Was that the phrasing of it?
Say it again?
I think that you said, would you recommend, we're concerned about ABC?
We are worried about ABC. Is there anything you can do to work with us?
Okay, that's always, that's kind of going back to the don't ask why. Why is your proposal so expensive? That's a great example of using a what or a how kind of a question that you can express your concerns, but then give them an opportunity to address them. So oh my gosh, we are right at time. So this has been so much fun. I always enjoy coming to Cvent Connect and meeting old friends and new friends, and I hope we can stay in touch. Thank you.